Once upon a time, deep in the heart of the American wilderness, where the scorching sun cast dancing shadows through the towering pines and ancient oaks, there lived a man whose name echoed throughout the holler as a symbol of faith and righteousness. Ezekiel was his name, and his story? Well, his story is one of those that makes any soul question the boundaries between the sacred and the profane, between the good and evil that dwell in this world. Ezekiel wasn't just any ordinary mountain man. Born and raised among the rugged hills and generous valleys of Appalachia, he carried in his chest a devotion that seemed to spring from the very earth he walked upon. His eyes, brown as rich soil after spring rain, reflected a serenity that only those truly connected with the Almighty could possess. In the small log cabin where he made his home, the walls were adorned with religious paintings, wooden crosses carved by his own calloused hands, and a humble altar where, every morning, before the sun even peeked over the ridge, Ezekiel would kneel in prayer. His words, whispered with the reverence of one who speaks directly with the Creator, rose to heaven like sacred incense. Ezekiel was father to 3 children, 2 boys and a girl whose names carried their father's faith: Joshua, Mary, and Francis. His wife Grace was a woman of strong character, the kind that the mountains forge with patience and wisdom. Together they formed a family united by bonds of love and faith, where prayers before meals were as essential as the food itself. Ezekiel's life followed the natural rhythm of the seasons. During the harsh winter months, when bitter cold cracked the earth and plants bowed in plea for warmth, he worked his small family plot, growing corn, beans, and potatoes with the persistence of one who knows that the Lord helps those who help themselves. His hands, rough from labor, handled the hoe with the same devotion with which he held his prayer beads during evening devotions. But it was during hunting season that Ezekiel found an additional source of sustenance for his family. When the first frost appeared on the meadow grass and the scent of autumn leaves filled the air, he prepared his 20-gauge shotgun, an inheritance from his daddy, and headed into the woods in search of game. Not for pleasure or sport, but out of necessity, to put meat on the table for his young'uns. Ezekiel was a respectful hunter. Before each outing, he'd kneel before the altar in his home and ask the Lord to bless his endeavor, to give him only what was necessary to feed his family without waste or greed. Lord, he'd murmur with closed eyes, hands clasped over his chest, grant me only what we need, nothing more, nothing less. And that's exactly what happened. Ezekiel never returned home empty-handed, but he also never brought back more than necessary. There seemed to be a divine connection between his faith and his aim. His neighbors used to joke that Ezekiel had the finger of God on his trigger, but he would just smile humbly and reply that everything was the Almighty's will. On that particular morning, which would forever mark Ezekiel's life and become legend in those parts, the sky dawned with a different hue. It wasn't quite the clear blue of ordinary days, nor the heavy gray that announced storms. It was a strange tone, almost violet, that made the birds sing more restlessly and the hounds howl for no apparent reason. Ezekiel woke before dawn, as was his custom. His bare feet touched the cold wooden floor, and he walked to the window of the simple cabin. Outside, the world was still wrapped in the shadows of late night, but it was already possible to make out the silhouettes of trees against the sky that slowly brightened. Something in the air that morning was different. Maybe it was the humidity that carried a more intense scent of vegetation, or perhaps it was the sounds of the forest that seemed closer, more vivid. Ezekiel couldn't define exactly what it was, but he felt deep in his soul that this day wouldn't be like the others. Grace was still sleeping, wrapped in the patchwork quilt she herself had sewn during the long winter nights. The children, in the small rooms nearby, breathed with the tranquility of childhood. Ezekiel smiled as he observed his family, whispered a prayer of gratitude, and went to the altar. Kneeling before the image of St. Francis of Assisi, his patron saint, Ezekiel began his morning prayers. His words, though whispered, carried a particular intensity that morning. St. Francis, my protector, guide my steps today. If it be the Lord's will that I find game, so be it. If not, help me accept it with humility. After prayers, Ezekiel prepared for another day of hunting. He put on his work clothes, denim overalls, faded from use, and a cotton shirt that Grace had mended several times. He laced up his leather boots, tied them carefully, and picked up his shotgun. Before leaving, he checked his ammunition. He had only 3 shells. It wasn't much, but Ezekiel rarely needed more than that. The wooden door creaked softly when he opened it. The air of the morning filled his lungs, carrying with it the perfume of damp vegetation and the still timid song of the first birds. Ezekiel breathed deeply, adjusted the shotgun on his shoulder, and began walking toward the woods. The journey to the region where he usually hunted took about an hour on foot. It was a path that Ezekiel knew like the back of his hand. Every rock, every bend, every tree that served as a landmark. As he moved away from home, the sound of civilization faded behind, replaced by the natural symphony of the forest. During the walk, Ezekiel kept his mind focused on silent prayers. They weren't formal prayers, memorized ones, but intimate conversations with God. Requests for protection, thanks for blessings received, reflections on life and faith. It was as if every step he took on the path was also a step toward the divine. The region where Ezekiel usually hunted was known locally as the Devil's Hollow. It was an area of dense vegetation, cut by a small creek that never completely dried up, not even during the harshest droughts. The trees there grew tall and leafy, creating a natural canopy that kept the environment always cooler and more humid. It was a perfect place for local wildlife. Raccoons, opossums, squirrels, and occasionally deer frequented the region in search of food and water. Ezekiel had discovered this place years ago, still young, and since then respected that piece of forest as a kind of natural sanctuary. That morning, however, when Ezekiel arrived at Devil's Hollow, he noticed that there was something different in the animals' behavior. The birds sang more agitatedly. Small mammals ran from one side to another with more haste than normal, and even the insects seemed more restless. Ezekiel positioned himself strategically near the creek, at a point where he usually had a good view of the places where animals came to drink water. He crouched behind a fallen log, adjusted his shotgun, and began his patient wait. Minutes passed slowly. The sun, which before only peeked over the horizon, was now higher, filtering its rays through the tree leaves and creating a play of lights and shadows on the forest floor. Ezekiel remained motionless, all his senses alert, waiting for the right moment. That's when he saw it. A large buck approached cautiously to the creek's edge. It was a robust animal, with antlers gleaming under the sun rays that managed to penetrate the vegetation. The buck looked around carefully before lowering its head to drink. Ezekiel breathed deeply, aimed carefully, and fired. The shot echoed through the forest, followed by a sudden silence, as if all of nature had held its breath for an instant. The buck fell immediately, without suffering. Ezekiel thanked the Lord for his sure aim and the animal's quick death without unnecessary suffering. He approached the buck and verified that the shot had been precise. The animal was dead, and it would be enough to feed his family for several days. He made the sign of cross and murmured a prayer of thanksgiving. "Thank you, Lord, for this food. May it nourish my family with health, and may nothing be wasted." The buck was heavy, and Ezekiel knew he'd have work to carry it home. He decided to first prepare the animal right there to make transport easier. He removed a sharp knife from his belt and began the cleaning work. It was a process that Ezekiel knew well and executed with respect for the animal. For him, this was not just a practical task, but almost a sacred ritual. While he worked, he continued his silent prayers, thanking for divine provision and asking that this food be blessed. The work took some time. The sun was already much higher when Ezekiel finished preparing the meat. He divided it into portions he could carry more easily and wrapped everything in large leaves he found near the creek. It was at that moment, when he was preparing to start the journey back home, that Ezekiel realized he wasn't alone in the forest. Initially, it was just a sensation, a kind of tingling in his neck, that primitive instinct that alerts us when we're being watched. Ezekiel stopped what he was doing and looked around, all his senses on maximum alert. The forest was strangely silent. The birds had stopped singing. The insects weren't making their usual buzzing. Even the wind seemed to have ceased. It was a heavy, oppressive silence that made Ezekiel's heart beat faster. That's when he saw her. At first, it was just a glimpse, a figure among the trees at a distance of about 50 yards. Ezekiel blinked, thinking it might just be a play of lights and shadows, but the figure was definitely there. It was a woman. But what a woman she was! Even from a distance, Ezekiel could perceive that she possessed extraordinary beauty, almost supernatural. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders like a silk curtain, moving gently, even though there was no wind. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and seemed to radiate its own light. The dress the woman wore seemed to be made of some fluid fabric that moved around her body as if it had a life of its own. The color of the dress was hard to define. Sometimes it seemed red, sometimes black, sometimes a mixture of both that created hypnotic patterns. But it was her eyes that most caught attention. Even from a distance, Ezekiel could feel the power of that gaze. They were eyes that seemed to see through his soul, that promised unimaginable pleasures and forbidden secrets. The woman smiled, and her smile was like lightning that pierced Ezekiel's heart. For a moment, just a brief moment, he felt his faith waver. He felt a powerful, magnetic attraction that seemed to come from somewhere very deep within him. But Ezekiel was a man of solid faith. Almost immediately, he recognized that there was something profoundly wrong with that situation. A woman, alone, in the forest, in the middle of nowhere? A woman whose beauty seemed to defy the laws of nature? A woman who made him feel things that contradicted all his values and commitments? Ezekiel closed his eyes tightly and began to pray. "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." The word sprang from his lips like a shield against whatever it was that stood before him. When he opened his eyes again, the woman had approached. Now she was only 20 yards away, and Ezekiel could see with even more clarity her disturbing beauty. He could see how her lips, red as blood, curved in a smile that promised delights and damnation at the same time. "Hello there, Ezekiel," she said, and her voice was like golden honey, sweet and enveloping, but with an undertone that made his spine shiver. "I've been waiting so long for this meeting." The fact that she knew his name made his hair stand on end. He gripped the shotgun tighter, although he knew instinctively that earthly weapons would have no effect against that creature. "Who are you?" asked Ezekiel, his voice trembling slightly, but remaining firm. "What do you want with me?" The woman laughed, and her laugh was like the sound of crystals breaking, beautiful and disturbing at the same time. I am many things, dear Ezekiel. I am the desire you repress, the passion you deny yourself to feel. She took a few more steps toward him, each movement charged with hypnotic sensuality. I see how you live, my dear, always working, always praying, always denying yourself life's pleasures. You're still young, strong, full of vigor. Why waste all that on abstinence and sacrifice? The woman's words were like serpents that coiled around Ezekiel's mind, whispering doubts about the life he had chosen. For a few seconds, he found himself questioning his choices, imagining what it would be like to abandon everything and surrender to that creature of impossible beauty. But then, the image of his family arose in his mind. Grace, with her tender smile and eyes full of love. Joshua, Mary, and Francis, his beloved children, depending on him for protection and sustenance. The small cabin with the altar, the morning prayers, the simple but purposeful life he had built. "No," said Ezekiel, his voice gaining strength. "I don't know who you are, but I know what you represent, and I have a family, I have commitments, I have faith." The woman's expression changed subtly. The seductive smile gave way to something darker, more threatening. "Family," she spat the word as if it were poison. "Commitments. What kind of life is that, Ezekiel? You work yourself to death to support a woman who no longer has the beauty of youth, and children who will one day leave and forget you." She approached even closer, now just a few yards away. Ezekiel could feel the heat emanating from her body, that heat that wasn't natural, that burned without warming. "Come with me, Ezekiel," she whispered, extending a hand with long fingers and nails red as blood. "I can give you riches beyond your imagination. I can give you powers that will make men fear and respect you. I can give you pleasures you don't even dream exist." For a moment, Ezekiel hesitated. The offer was tempting, the promises were seductive. But then he felt his prayer beads in his pocket, and that was like an awakening. Quickly, he pulled out the beads and held them before him like a shield. The simple wooden beads, polished by constant use, seemed to shine with their own light. "In the name of Jesus Christ," Ezekiel declared, his voice now firm and powerful, "I command you to get away from me." The woman's reaction was immediate and terrifying. Her beautiful face contorted in an expression of pure fury, and for an instant Ezekiel could see through the mask of beauty to the true nature of the creature before him. Her eyes were no longer seductive, but were like coals from hell. Her perfect skin showed itself to be scaly and repugnant. Her nails grew, becoming claws sharp as razors, and from her mouth, once so tempting, now sprouted fangs like those of a wild beast. "Damn you, Ezekiel!" roared the creature, its voice now guttural and full of hate. "You don't know what you're rejecting. You don't know what could have been yours." But Ezekiel stood firm, continuing to hold the prayer beads and recite prayers. "I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth." As the words of the creed sprang from his lips, the creature seemed to shrink, as if each word was a physical blow. It retreated, hissing like a cornered snake. "This isn't over, Ezekiel," it threatened, its form already beginning to dissolve like smoke. "You rejected me today, but there are others. There are always others who aren't as devout as you." And with those words, the creature disappeared completely, leaving only a strong smell of sulfur in the air and a sense of cold that penetrated to the bones. Ezekiel remained motionless for several minutes, still holding the prayer beads, still murmuring prayers. His heart was beating like a drum in his chest, and his hands trembled slightly. He had faced the devil himself and emerged victorious, but the experience had shaken his strength. Gradually, the natural sounds of the forest began to return. The birds resumed singing, the insects resumed their buzzing, even the wind seemed to have ceased. It was a heavy, oppressive silence that made Ezekiel's heart beat faster. Ezekiel made the sign of the cross several times, thanking the Lord for protecting him in that moment of trial. He knew that he had been tested, and that, by divine grace, he had managed to remain firm in his faith. He gathered his things, picked up the buckmeat, and began the journey back home. During the entire walk, he continued praying, thanking, reflecting on what had happened. When he finally arrived home, the sun was already high in the sky. Grace was in the yard, hanging clothes on the line, and the children were playing near the house. Seeing Ezekiel approaching, they all ran toward him. "Daddy brought meat!" shouted Joshua, the eldest son, seeing the bundles that Ezekiel carried.
"Was it a good hunt?" asked Grace, observing her husband's face attentively. She knew him too well not to notice that something different had happened. Ezekiel handed the meat to Grace and stroked his children's hair. "It was an interesting hunt," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "The Lord protected me and brought me back safely." Grace noticed there was more to the story, but she knew her husband well enough to know he would tell her when he felt ready. For now, it was enough to be certain that he was well and home. That night, after dinner and after the children went to sleep, Ezekiel told Grace what had happened in the forest. He described the encounter with the demonic creature, the temptation he had faced, and how his faith had saved him. Grace listened in silence, her eyes wide, sometimes making the sign of the cross. When Ezekiel finished his account, she held his hands and said, "My dear, the Lord allowed this to happen to show the strength of your faith. You were tested like Job was tested, and you emerged victorious." "Perhaps," replied Ezekiel, "but I confess that for a moment, just a moment, I felt my faith waver. The temptation was powerful, more than anything I had ever experienced." "But you didn't give in," Grace reminded him. "That's what matters. It's not the absence of temptation that makes us holy, but the ability to resist it." Ezekiel nodded, feeling consoled by his wife's words. Together, they knelt before the altar at home and made a long prayer of thanksgiving for divine protection. But the story doesn't end here. In the days that followed, Ezekiel noticed subtle changes around him. His faith, far from being shaken by the encounter with the devil, became even stronger. His prayers were more intense, his devotion deeper. Even more interesting were the blessings that began to appear in his life. The small plot, which before produced only enough for the family's survival, began to yield abundant crops. The hunts became even more successful. Work opportunities appeared almost miraculously. It was as if the Lord was rewarding Ezekiel for his faithfulness in the moment of trial. The news of Ezekiel's encounter with the devil spread throughout the region, although he had only told Grace. But these things have a way of leaking out, and soon neighbors began seeking him out for spiritual advice and prayers. Ezekiel never considered himself a special or holy man. For him, he had simply done what any person of faith should do when confronted with evil. But the people in the region began to see him as someone who was touched by the divine, someone whose faith was so strong it could resist even the most powerful temptations of the devil. Over time, Ezekiel became a kind of informal spiritual counselor for the community. People came from far away to hear him speak about faith, to ask for his prayers, to seek guidance in times of difficulty. He always received everyone with humility, remembering that he was just an ordinary man who had been blessed by God's grace. He never charged money for his prayers or advice, always remembering that spiritual gifts should not be commercialized. Years passed, and the story of Ezekiel's confrontation with the devil became legend in the region. Fathers told the story to their children as an example of how faith can protect us even in the most dangerous situations. Young people who felt tempted to abandon the paths of righteousness remembered Ezekiel's story and found strength to resist. But for Ezekiel, the most important experience wasn't becoming a respected figure in the community. It was the absolute certainty that the Lord is always present, especially in the moments of greatest trial. Every time he went hunting, Ezekiel passed by the place where he had encountered the devil. The place was never the same for him. There was a sacred presence there, as if the very ground had been sanctified by the confrontation between good and evil. On one of these visits, years after the original encounter, Ezekiel decided to erect a small wooden cross at the site. It wasn't out of ostentation or to mark territory, but as a constant reminder of the power of faith and divine protection. The simple cross, made with his own hands from local wood, became a pilgrimage point for people from all around. Many came to pray there, ask for protection, give thanks for blessings received. Ezekiel was surprised by the veneration people showed for the place, but he understood that, for many, that cross represented something greater than the simple confrontation between a man and the devil. It represented a proof that true faith can overcome any adversity. As he aged, Ezekiel became even more devout. His hair turned gray, his body bent under the weight of years and work, but his eyes maintained the same serenity and determination as always. Grace, his faithful companion, aged beside him, and together they saw their children grow up, marry, and have grandchildren. The small cabin was expanded over the years to accommodate the growing family, but the altar always remained in the same place, always cared for with the same devotion as before. Joshua, the eldest son, inherited much of his father's faith and became a respected person in the community. Mary married a good man and raised her children with the same values she had learned at home. Francis, the youngest, followed in his father's footsteps and also became a man of solid faith. But Ezekiel's influence extended far beyond his immediate family. For decades, he served as a living example that it's possible to live a life of righteousness even in a world full of temptations. People who had lost faith found new hope upon hearing his story. Young people who were straying from the right path found motivation to change their lives. Families in crisis discovered that prayer and faith could overcome any difficulty. Ezekiel never considered himself a preacher or missionary. He saw himself simply as a man who had received a special grace from God and who had the responsibility to share that grace with others. His sermons, if we can call them that, were always simple and direct. He spoke of the importance of daily prayer, the value of the family, the need to resist temptations, the certainty that the Lord never abandons those who trust in Him. Faith, he used to say, isn't the absence of doubts or temptations. Faith is the ability to remain firm despite doubts and temptations. This phrase became a kind of motto for many people in the region and was frequently quoted in times of difficulty. Over the years, Ezekiel's story began to be told in other regions. Travelers passing through the area heard the account and took it with them, spreading the legend of the mountain man who had resisted the temptations of the devil himself. Each person who told the story added their own details, and gradually the legend grew and modified. In some versions, the devil appeared as an elegant gentleman offering riches. In others, it was a giant serpent that spoke with a human voice. But the core of the story always remained the same: a simple man of solid faith who had resisted the ultimate temptation. Ezekiel was amused when he heard these modified versions of his story. Folks like to embellish things, he'd say, laughing to Grace. Pretty soon, they'll say I wrestled hand to hand with the devil and came away carrying his horns as a trophy. But behind the good humor, Ezekiel understood the importance of these stories. Even with the exaggerations and modifications, they carried a powerful message about the power of faith and the importance of staying firm in one's values. There were also those who doubted Ezekiel's story, skeptics who believed it was all just fantasy, people who argued that devils don't exist and that the whole experience had been the product of the imagination of a simple countryman. Ezekiel was never bothered by these skeptics. "Everyone believes what they want to believe," he used to say. "I know what I experienced, and that's enough for me. If my story helps some folks keep their faith, then it served its purpose." Indeed, there were evidence that supported Ezekiel's version. People in the region remembered that on that specific day, animal behavior was strange throughout the area. Dogs howled for hours without any apparent reason. Cattle became restless, and even chickens in the yards behaved abnormally.
But for Ezekiel, these proofs were irrelevant. His faith didn't depend on the approval or acceptance of others. He knew he had faced evil and had won, and that was all that mattered. As age advanced, Ezekiel began to reflect more deeply on the meaning of his experience. Why had the devil chosen to tempt him? Why at that specific moment in his life? Over time, he reached some conclusions. He believed he had been tested precisely because his faith was strong. The devil doesn't waste time with those who are already lost. He goes after those who can make a difference, those whose fall would cause more damage. This interpretation gave Ezekiel an even greater sense of responsibility. If he had been chosen to be tempted, it meant that the Lord saw potential in him for something greater, and he was determined not to disappoint that divine trust. In his final years of life, Ezekiel became even more generous with his time and resources. He helped widows with work on their properties, taught young people about farming and hunting, and always had a word of comfort for those going through difficulties. His house became a reference point in the community. People knew they could seek out Ezekiel at any hour of the day or night if they needed help, advice, or simply someone who would listen to them with patience and understanding. One of the most touching stories from Ezekiel's later years involves a young man named Samuel, who had gotten involved with bad company and was heading toward perdition. The mother, a desperate widow, sought out Ezekiel in tears, begging him to talk to her son. Ezekiel not only talked to Samuel, but took him on several hunting trips, teaching him not only how to hunt, but also valuable lessons about life, responsibility, and faith. During these expeditions, far from the negative influences of town, Samuel rediscovered values he had lost. The young man not only changed his life, but became one of the most respected members of the community years later. Until the end of his life, Samuel credited his transformation to those days in the woods with Ezekiel, learning not only how to hunt, but how to be a real man. Stories like these were common in Ezekiel's life. He possessed a natural ability to see potential in people and help them find their way back to the light. Some said it was a special gift, a blessing he had received after his confrontation with the devil. Others believed it was simply the result of his kind nature and deep faith. Ezekiel never speculated about the origin of this ability. He simply used it for good whenever possible. The place where he had erected the cross also continued to be an important point in the region's spiritual life. During times of drought, people gathered there to pray for rain. When there were epidemics or difficulties, entire communities made pilgrimages to the cross to ask for divine protection. Ezekiel personally took care of maintaining the site. Every 6 months, he checked if the cross was in good condition, cleaned the surrounding area, and sometimes planted wildflowers that gave color and life to the small improvised sanctuary. During these maintenance visits, Ezekiel always reserved time for prayer and reflection. Kneeling before the cross he had erected with his own hands, he mentally relived that fateful day when he had faced the devil. These reflections didn't fill him with pride or vanity, but rather with humility and gratitude. He constantly remembered that he had been just an instrument in God's hands, and that his victory over the devil hadn't been the result of his own strength, but of divine grace. Lord, he would murmur during these prayers, thank you for choosing me for this test. Thank you for giving me strength to resist. Continue using me however you want for your glory. And the Lord seemed to really continue using Ezekiel. Until his final days, he maintained the ability to positively influence the lives of people around him. When Ezekiel turned 70, the community organized a celebration in his honor. It wasn't an ordinary party, but a special gathering at a small local chapel where people from throughout the region came to pay tribute to the man who had become legend in life. During the celebration, dozens of people stood up to tell how Ezekiel had influenced their lives. There were stories of people who had found faith through his words, of families that had been reunited through his advice, of young people who had changed the course of their lives after his teachings. Ezekiel listened to everything in silence, with tears in his eyes, constantly making the sign of cross and whispering thanks to God. For him, this was not a celebration of his deeds, but a confirmation that God had used his experience in the woods to bless many other lives. I am nothing, he said when he finally stood up to speak. I'm just an ordinary man who was lucky enough to be chosen by the Lord for a special purpose. Everything that happened in my life is the result of divine grace, not any merit of mine. His words, spoken with genuine sincerity, moved those present even more. Here was a man who had become a legend, but who maintained the humility of always. Ezekiel's final years were marked by even greater serenity. He seemed to have found a deep peace, an absolute certainty that he had fulfilled the purpose for which God had placed him on earth. He continued working the land while his strength allowed it, but gradually transferred more responsibilities to his sons and sons-in-law. His hunting trips became less frequent, but when he went, he always returned with interesting stories and valuable lessons. Grace, his lifelong companion, remained by his side with the same dedication as always. Together they saw their grandchildren grow and begin to have their own children, perpetuating the family they had built with so much love and faith. One of Ezekiel's last great joys was seeing one of his grandsons, also named Ezekiel in his honor, decide to follow a religious vocation. The young man entered the seminary and later became a minister, dedicating his life to serving God and the community. "Look here, Grace," Ezekiel said with a proud smile when he learned of his grandson's decision. "The Lord is raising up a new generation to continue his work. Our family will always have someone dedicated to divine service." Reverend Ezekiel, as he became known, always credited his vocation to the stories he heard from his grandfather since childhood. "It was he who taught me that God can use ordinary people to do extraordinary things," he used to say in his sermons. As he approached 80 years old, Ezekiel began to speak more about death, but always without fear or sadness. For him, death was simply the next stage of his spiritual journey, the moment when he would finally meet face to face with the God he had served throughout his life. "I'm not afraid of death," he said once to Grace. "I lived a full life. I was blessed with a wonderful family. I had the opportunity to help many people. When my time comes, I'll be ready." Grace, also a woman of faith, felt sad with these conversations. She couldn't imagine life without her companion of so many years. But she understood that Ezekiel's serenity before death was the result of his deep faith and a life well lived. Ezekiel spent his final months visiting important places in his life, silently saying goodbye to each of them. He returned several times to the place where he had faced the devil, always praying and thanking for that experience that had shaped his entire subsequent existence. During one of these visits, accompanied by his minister grandson, Ezekiel made a surprising revelation. "You know, son," he said, "sometimes I think that encounter with the devil was the greatest blessing of my life." His grandson was surprised by this statement. "How so, Grandpa?" "Because it was there that I truly discovered who I was. It was there that my faith was truly tested and came out strengthened. It was from that day that I really began to live a life of purpose. Before that, I was just a good man. After that, I became an instrument of God." This perspective on his most significant experience showed the depth of wisdom that Ezekiel had acquired over the years. He had transformed what could have been a trauma into a source of strength and purpose. Ezekiel passed away on a quiet Sunday morning, exactly as he had wished. He woke up early, said his morning prayers as always, had coffee with Grace, and then lay down for a nap. He simply never woke up. Grace found him a few hours later with a serene smile on his face and his prayer beads in his hands. He seemed to be sleeping peacefully, as if he had simply passed from this world to the next without any suffering.
Ezekiel's funeral was one of the largest the region had ever seen. People traveled from distant places to pay their last respects to the man who had become legend in life. The small local chapel couldn't accommodate all the attendees, and the ceremony had to be held outdoors. During the funeral, his minister grandson gave a touching homily in which he recalled not only the story of the confrontation with the devil, but an entire life dedicated to serving God and neighbor. "My grandfather always said he wasn't a special man," said the young minister. "But maybe that's exactly what made him so special. He was an ordinary man who allowed God to do extraordinary things through him." After the funeral, people gathered at the site of the famous cross that Ezekiel had erected. There they held a collective prayer, thanking God for the life of that simple man who had touched so many other lives. Grace lived several more years after Ezekiel's death, always cared for lovingly by her children and grandchildren. She became the official keeper of her husband's stories, telling and retelling to new generations the most significant episodes of his life. The story of Ezekiel's confrontation with the devil continued to be told long after his death. It became part of local folklore, passed from generation to generation, always carrying the same powerful message about the power of faith. The cross he had erected at the site of the encounter with the devil was later replaced by a larger one, made of stone, built by the community in his memory. The site officially became a pilgrimage point, visited by faithful from throughout the region. Years later, a writer who passed through the region heard the story and decided to record it in writing. The book he published took Ezekiel's legend to an even larger audience, spreading his story throughout the country. But perhaps Ezekiel's most important legacy isn't in the books or monuments erected in his memory. It's in the lives he touched, in the people who found hope through his story, in the faith he helped strengthen in shaken hearts. His family continued the tradition of faith he had established. His children raised their own children with the same values, and so on. The small cabin where he had lived was preserved by the family, remaining as a symbol of simplicity and devotion. The altar where Ezekiel said his morning prayers remained intact and is still used today by the family's descendants for their own prayers. They say there's something special about that place, a presence of peace and holiness that can be felt by any person of faith who enters there. Today, decades after his death, Ezekiel's name is still remembered with respect and admiration in the region. His story is told as an example of how true faith can overcome any adversity, of how an ordinary man can make a difference in the world simply by remaining faithful to his values. For skeptics, Ezekiel may have been just a simple countryman who had an experience that he interpreted through his religious worldview. But for those who believe, he was a true saint, a man who faced the devil himself and emerged victorious through the strength of his faith. Regardless of the interpretation each person gives to his story, there's something undeniable in Ezekiel's legacy. He lived a life of purpose, dedicated to good and service to others. He faced life's temptations with dignity, maintained his faith even in the most difficult moments, and left the world better than he found it. And perhaps that's the true moral of the story of Ezekiel, the devout mountain man who faced the devil. No matter what temptations we encounter on our path, no matter how powerful the forces that try to divert us from our values, we always have the choice to remain faithful to what we believe is right.
Ezekiel's faith wasn't just an abstract belief in God, but a way of life that guided him in every decision, in every action, in every moment of his existence. And it was this lived, practiced, and demonstrated faith through concrete actions that gave him the strength to resist even the most powerful temptations. His story continues to echo through time, reminding us that true heroes aren't those who possess supernatural powers, but those who, like Ezekiel, remain firm in their principles even when the whole world seems to conspire to make them yield. And so ends the story of Ezekiel, the devout mountain man, a simple man who became legend not for having conquered kingdoms or accumulated riches, but for having won the most important battle of all, the battle fought within his own soul between good and evil. May his story serve as inspiration for all of us, reminding us that no matter how humble our origins or how modest our circumstances, we all have the potential to make choices that can change not only our own lives, but the lives of all those around us. Ezekiel's faith remains alive not only in the stone cross that marks the site of his confrontation with the devil, but in the heart of all those who hear his story and find in it strength to face their own temptations and challenges. And who knows, perhaps somewhere in the American wilderness there still exist today men and women like Ezekiel, simple people but of deep faith, ready to face any adversity with the most powerful weapon of all, an unshakable faith in the power of good over evil, of light over darkness, of love over hate. This is the true lesson of Ezekiel's story, that the strength to win life's greatest battles doesn't come from weapons or riches, but from the faith we carry in our hearts and the determination to never abandon what we believe to be true and just. So it be. And may the memory of Ezekiel, the devout mountain man who faced the devil, continue to inspire future generations to remain firm in their faith no matter what challenges life may present. The legend of Ezekiel spread far beyond the mountain hollows where it began. Traveling preachers carried his tale to distant congregations, where it was told in revival tents and country churches throughout the American frontier. In the great cities of the East, scholars and theologians debated the story's meaning, but in the simple country churches and mountain chapels, folks knew its truth in their hearts. They had lived it, breathed it, felt its power in their own struggles against temptations and doubt. The stone cross at Devil's Hollow became a landmark known throughout several states. Maps began marking it, and guidebooks mentioned it as a place of spiritual significance. Pilgrims came not just from neighboring counties, but from as far as New York and California, seeking the peace and strength that seemed to emanate from that sacred ground. The old-timers in the region would tell visitors that on quiet mornings, just after sunrise, you could still feel Ezekiel's presence near the cross. They'd say the air seemed different there, charged with a kind of holy electricity that made your skin tingle and your heart beat faster with reverence. Children who grew up hearing Ezekiel's story carried it with them as they moved west with the expanding frontier. Cowboys around campfires in Texas told it. Gold miners in California whispered it in their tents. Farmers in Kansas shared it during barn raisings. Each telling added new details, new flavors, but the core remained the same. A simple man's faith had proved stronger than the devil's temptations. As America grew and changed, as trains replaced wagons and cities sprouted where once there had been only wilderness, Ezekiel's story remained constant. In an age of rapid change and uncertainty, people found comfort in the tale of a man who knew exactly where he stood and refused to be moved from that ground. The little log cabin where Ezekiel had lived became a shrine of sorts. The local historical society eventually took over its care, maintaining it exactly as it had been in Ezekiel's time. The altar remained in place, still decorated with the same simple wooden cross he had carved with his own hands. Visitors to the cabin often reported feeling a profound sense of peace within its walls. Some claimed to hear the echo of morning prayers. Others spoke of feeling an invisible presence that seemed to radiate love and strength.
Whether these experiences were real or imagined mattered little to those who felt them. They left the cabin renewed in their own faith and purpose. The hunting rifle that Ezekiel had carried that fateful day was preserved in the cabin, mounted above the fireplace. Beside it hung a simple wooden plaque with his most famous saying carved into it. Faith isn't the absence of doubts or temptations. Faith is the ability to remain firm despite doubts and temptations. These words became a cornerstone of American folk wisdom, quoted by everyone from country preachers to presidents. They found their way into graduation speeches, wedding ceremonies, and funeral services. They were carved into courthouse walls and printed on church bulletins across the nation.
Ezekiel's descendants continued to live in the region for generations, many of them becoming preachers, teachers, and community leaders. They carried forward his legacy not through boastfulness or pride, but through quiet service and unwavering moral conviction. They were known throughout the mountains as people you could count on, folks who would never break their word or betray a trust. The annual Ezekiel Day celebration, begun on the 50th anniversary of his death, drew thousands of visitors to the small mountain community. It wasn't a carnival or fair, but a day of reflection, prayer, and storytelling. Old-timers would share their memories of Ezekiel, while newcomers learned about the man who had faced down the devil himself. During these celebrations, people would walk the path from Ezekiel's cabin to the cross at Devil's Hollow, retracing his steps on that legendary morning. Many reported that the walk itself became a spiritual experience, a time of personal reflection and renewal. The local church, which had grown from a small chapel to a substantial building over the years, displayed a beautiful stained glass window depicting Ezekiel's encounter with the devil. The window showed him standing firm with his prayer beads raised, while a dark figure retreated into shadows. Sunlight streaming through the colored glass seemed to make the scene come alive, particularly during morning services when the light was strongest. Educational institutions began studying Ezekiel's story as part of American folklore curricula. Scholars noted how the tale reflected the frontier spirit of self-reliance combined with deep faith, values that had shaped the American character during the nation's formative years. But for all the academic interest and scholarly analysis, Ezekiel's story remained at its heart a simple tale of good versus evil, of a man tested and found worthy. It spoke to something fundamental in the human experience, something that transcended time and culture. As the 20th century dawned and America entered the modern age, some predicted that old stories like Ezekiel's would fade away, replaced by more sophisticated understanding of psychology and human behavior. Instead, the opposite happened. As life became more complex and uncertain, people found themselves drawn even more strongly to stories of moral clarity and spiritual strength. During the Great Depression, when many Americans faced their own versions of temptation and despair, churches across the nation held special services dedicated to Ezekiel's memory. His story reminded people that poverty and hardship were temporary, but faith and character were eternal. During World War II, soldiers carried copies of Ezekiel's story in their pockets, finding courage in the tale of a man who had faced ultimate evil and emerged victorious. Chaplains reported that the story was one of the most requested during difficult times, providing comfort and strength to men far from home. In more recent times, as America has grappled with social change and moral uncertainty, Ezekiel's story has found new relevance. His example of standing firm in one's beliefs while treating all people with kindness and respect has resonated with Americans seeking guidance in turbulent times. The stone cross at Devil's Hollow has weathered many storms over the decades, but it stands as solid as ever, a testament to the enduring power of faith and the memory of one man's courage. Park services now maintain the site, ensuring that future generations will be able to visit this piece of American spiritual heritage. And so the story continues, passed from parent to child, from preacher to congregation, from friend to friend. Each telling plants seeds of faith and courage in new hearts, ensuring that Ezekiel's legacy will never truly die. In a world that often seems to celebrate cynicism and doubt, the story of Ezekiel, the devout mountain man who faced the devil, stands as a beacon of hope. It reminds us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they hold fast to their convictions and trust in something greater than themselves. Perhaps that is the greatest miracle of all. Not that one man faced down the devil, but that his story continues to inspire others to face down their own devils, whatever form they may take. In doing so, Ezekiel's victory becomes everyone's victory, and his faith becomes a light that can never be extinguished. And there, in the quiet mountains where it all began, where the morning mist still rises from Devil's Hollow and the stone cross stands sentinel against the sky, you can almost hear an echo of that long-ago prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Carried on the wind like a promise that good will always triumph, that faith will always find a way, and that no darkness can overcome the light of a truly devoted heart. The end. Thus concludes the tale of Ezekiel, the devout mountain man who faced the devil and won, not through force of arms or cunning, but through the simple, unshakable power of faith. His story lives on wherever people gather to share tales of courage, conviction, and the triumph of good over evil. In every telling, his victory is renewed, and his light shines a little brighter in our troubled world.